He hadn't heard another human voice in nearly 7 years. The mountains were his only company, wind through pines, coyotes at dusk, and silence thick enough to forget the world below. But one night, through the snow and moonlight, came a sound he'd long thought he'd never hear again, a woman's cry. When he found her, half frozen and weeping by the creek, her first words were not for help, they were a confession. What she told him beneath that dying fire would drag every ghost he'd buried back into the light and reveal a truth about his past that could shatter the life he thought he'd left behind forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The first step was the worst because it made the next inevitable, and by the time he'd pushed his shoulder into the white roar and hoisted her across his back, the blizzard had swallowed every landmark he trusted, reducing the world to needles of ice and a weight that breathed against his neck in ragged, weakening bursts. She was light the way driftwood is light, deceptive. Sodden with cold, yet she clung fiercely to a small leather pouch pressed between her chest and his coat. Fingers locked around it so tight he could feel the bones grate against his collarbone with each stumble uphill. And when he tried once to pry it loose, meaning only to free her grip so he could hold her better, she made a sound through cracked lips that wasn't quite a word but carried the same meaning as a knife. No. Snow packed into his beard and lashes, the moon a dull coin half buried in the storm, and he moved by memory more than sight, counting paces, tasting the iron of blood where wind had split his lip, every few steps stopping to listen for creek-snap dangers in the trees above or the muffled rush of the creek to his left. The cabin, when he finally saw its shadow, appeared like a trick of the cold, a darker shape in a world of white, and he shouldered the door with a grunt that seemed to tear something loose inside his ribs, tumbling them both into a darkness that smelled of pine pitch and old smoke. He kicked the door shut, slid the bar into place, and lowered her onto the pallet by the hearth, working with clumsy gentleness to roll her to her side, while his hands remembered tasks his mind had forgotten: banking coals, striking tinder, feeding the fire in a ladder of kindling until its crackle pushed the storm back to the edges of the room. The woman shook as if the cold were trying to argue her out of living, teeth chattering so hard he feared she'd bite her tongue. But still her fist held that pouch, knuckles white and swollen. And when he eased a blanket over her and reached again, as careful as lifting a fawn from a trap, she hissed, no, clear enough to make him snatch his hand away. All right, he said in the sound of his voice, rough with disuse after 7 winters of speaking mostly to horses and weather, startled them both, so he tried again, softer. All right, keep it. And then he poured water, hot and thin, trickled it against her lips until the tremor in her jaw changed from violence to shiver, and found dry wool from a trunk he hadn't opened since the last time Laughter had lived here. Turning his back as much for her pride as his own unease, he left the bundle within reach and busied himself with the kettle, the bacon, anything that smelled like life. After a while, the blizzard became a dull animal outside, pacing, snarling, denied. She'd managed to dress, clumsy, stubborn, keeping the blanket and the pouch both, and when he knelt to adjust the quilt near her feet, she touched his sleeve, the smallest weight, a thanks made of skin and heat. Creak, she whispered, breath rattling. I thought the ice would hold, and her laugh was the brittle kind that happens right where crying would do more good. He nodded because there was nothing better to say, and because he knew that creek, knew where it sheathed itself in treachery after the first hard freeze, and he wondered what brought her onto his mountain in a storm that would have made wiser animals den. Steam, bacon, the clean copper taste of thawing blood, these filled the cabin until it almost felt like a place someone could be born again in. She drank a little, then slept the illness sleep that drops a body like a rock into dark water. And in that quiet he studied the pouch by firelight, its leather gone soft with years of handling, worn smooth at the corners, the thong tied in a knot that had seen patient fingers many times. He didn't untie it, though the urge chewed at him, because 7 years of living with ghosts had taught him that the thing you open can be the thing you never close again. Instead, he sat with his back to the door, old habit, listening to the storm scour the world while dawn strained somewhere miles off, and every so often she would surface from sleep to murmur a name he didn't recognize and clutch the pouch harder, as if the heart of her story beat inside it, and he understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with weather, that whatever she'd carried through the snow wasn't only for keeping it, was for breaking his life open. The light of dawn bled slow through the chinks of the shutters, thin and gray as smoke, crawling across the cabin floor until it touched the woman's face and made her look less ghostly, though not less haunted. She sat near the hearth wrapped in the blanket he'd given her hair still damp at the ends, steam rising faintly from it as the fire did its quiet work of turning night into memory. And for a long while he watched without speaking, spoon idle in his hand, because after 7 years of solitude, words felt like fragile tools, easy to break, dangerous to use too early. When he finally said, "You're warm enough?" it came out as a statement more than a question, and she nodded once, eyes on the flames, her profile sharp and weary like someone carved from worry rather than born. Silence filled the room, not awkward but heavy, the kind that carries more truth than talk, and when he set a plate beside her with bacon and beans, she didn't eat, only stared until the grease cooled, and then she said it, voice thin as the smoke rising from the fire. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words fell between them like an axe head, clean and final, making his pulse stumble because something about the shape of her face, the scar at her wrist, the way her eyes lingered on him, not pleading, not accusing, just knowing, tugged at a place in him he'd buried with every other name he'd promised never to recall. He shifted, uneasy, reaching for the kettle just to have his hands busy, and asked, "Should I?" Not to mock her, but because it felt safer than admitting he didn't like the way his chest had tightened. She smiled then, slow and sad, and the look of it made the room feel smaller, the air thinner. "No," she said, and turned back to the fire. "I suppose that's a mercy." Outside, snow hissed softly against the logs, melting under the newborn sun, and the sound reminded him of a time before exile, before he'd chosen silence over people, before guilt had driven him up the mountain like a hunted thing, but he shoved the memory down deep, where it couldn't speak. He noticed her leather pouch still close to her side, fingers brushing it now and again like it might bite if left alone, and something in him wanted to know what weight she carried that had brought her through a storm men wouldn't ride in. "You came a long way," he said, careful, neutral. "Don't seem like you had much choice." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw that her eyes weren't just hollow, they were rimmed with grief that had gone past tears, the kind that had learned to live without hope. "Choice," she echoed. That's a word men like to use when they think they have it. The bitterness in her tone cut through him, and for reasons he didn't understand, it felt personal, like she wasn't just speaking to him, but about him. He opened his mouth, closed it again. She went on, quieter. "You once knew a woman like me," she said, "but she died before you did." His heart stumbled again. There were too many ghosts that sentence could summon, but the name wouldn't come. He had lived too long without people, without memory, letting the mountains grind his past into dust. Yet now, in this thin light, something of it stirred the echo of laughter, the scent of wildflowers near a river long ago, the feel of another hand in his. "Who are you?" he asked finally, the question thick in his throat. She looked toward the window, where the snow had turned to rain, and whispered, "The one who remembers what you forgot." Then she rose, slow and trembling, and stepped to the door, staring out into the brightening storm like she could see a whole other world waiting there. He watched her, confusion and unease coiling tight in his gut, and for the first time in 7 years he felt afraid not of dying, but of remembering what he'd done to deserve this silence. The storm came back with a vengeance that afternoon, not with snow but with sleet and wind that clawed at the walls like something alive, howling through the cracks as though trying to drag the past in by force, and he sat at the table sharpening a knife he didn't need just to keep his hands from shaking while she stood near the fire, her eyes fixed on the window where the gray sky pressed down against the mountains like a closing fist. It had been hours since she'd spoken, and he'd begun to think maybe the morning's strange words had been nothing but fever and exhaustion. But then she turned, slow, deliberate, and said his name, not the one the traders or trappers used when they passed through, not the one he signed on the rare supply ledgers from town, but the old one, the real one, the name he'd buried with the man he used to be. It hit him like a hammer to the chest, a sound that carried too many echoes, his mother's voice calling it from a porch long gone. A woman's whisper of it in the dark before the war, the way it had been cursed from wanted posters before he vanished into these mountains for good. The knife slipped in his hand and clattered to the floor, and for a long moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't even find anger, only that deep old ache of recognition that felt like drowning in memories he'd sealed away. "Don't," he rasped, voice breaking like old timber. But she only said it again, slower this time, each syllable shaped with the care of someone who had carried it in her mouth for years. "How do you—" he started, but she cut him off, stepping closer, her face pale in the firelight. "Because I was there," she said, "when you became someone else." The words made no sense and every sense all at once. He stared at her, really looked now, past the weariness, past the travel-worn clothes, and the scar on her hand, searching for something familiar, something that would make the world fit back into its place. And then, in the smallest shift of her features, the tilt of her chin, he saw it a resemblance, faint but undeniable, to a girl who'd stood beside him once on a summer night thick with smoke and screams. The daughter of a man he'd wronged, the last witness to the ruin he'd left behind before the mountains swallowed him whole. His stomach twisted, the taste of iron in his mouth as realization crawled through him like frost. "You should have stayed away," he managed, the words more plea than warning. But she only shook her head, eyes glinting with something between sorrow and accusation. "You thought you could bury it," she said. "But the dead don't stay buried when they've got someone left to remember." The wind roared then, rattling the shutters, and the fire spat a shower of sparks that leapt between them before dying into ash, as though the storm itself had flinched from what hung in the air. He rose slowly, joints stiff, years of silence cracking under the weight of a past suddenly breathing again. "If you came for revenge," he said, "you're late by a lifetime." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat, fingers trembling slightly, and drew out the leather pouch, the same one she'd carried through the blizzard, the one she'd never let him touch. She set it gently on the table between them. "Not revenge," she whispered. "Remembrance." His heart kicked hard against his ribs as she loosened the tie and the scent of old cedar drifted out. And when she tipped it open, something small and metallic slid onto the table, a silver locket. Tarnished but unmistakable. He knew it before she said a word. The initials engraved on it were his own, and the locket had once hung around the neck of the only person he'd ever loved enough to ruin everything for. "You left this," she said, voice trembling now. "You left us." He couldn't move, couldn't even speak. The storm outside faded beneath the sound of his heartbeat, the whole cabin shrinking to the space between that locket and the hand that set it down. And he realized with bone-deep certainty that whatever story had brought her here wasn't just about the past, it was the past itself, come to collect what he owed. The fire had burned low, its glow dimmed to a bruised amber pulse that threw long shadows up the cabin walls, and though she'd finally succumbed to sleep, her body curled near the hearth, breath soft and steady as if the storm's fury had never happened. He sat rigid in the chair opposite her, every muscle locked, his mind a tangle of ghosts clawing for air. The locket lay on the table beside the pouch, gleaming faintly in the firelight like an accusation that refused to sleep with her, and he stared at it until the flickering reflection of his face warped into something he couldn't bear to look at any longer. When the next gust of wind rattled the shutters, he reached for the pouch almost without thinking, his fingers shaking as they brushed the soft, worn leather, the faint warmth of it still holding her touch. The knot at its top had been loosened earlier, so it took little effort to pull it open, though each motion felt like peeling back the skin of an old wound that had never properly healed. He half expected more trinkets, some token of the life she'd lived before the mountains found her, but what slid into his palm instead was a folded, yellowed piece of paper, its creases deep, the edges torn and darkened by time. His name was written across the back in a script he knew as well as his own, because it was his own. For a long moment he just stared at it, throat tight, every breath a question that had no right to exist. The paper felt fragile, as though it might disintegrate if he opened it, and yet the need to see, to remember, was stronger than fear. He unfolded it slowly, the sound of old fibers cracking sharp against the storm outside, and the words leapt up to meet him like ghosts rising from their graves. It was a letter he'd written years ago, back before the silence, before the self-imposed exile, when he still believed forgiveness might find him if he sent the right words into the world. The ink had bled in spots, but the message was clear, each line striking with cruel precision because it came from a man he no longer recognized. My dearest Clara, if the world allows it, I'll come back for you. If not, know that I never stopped carrying your name, even when it became a curse. I am sorry for the fire, for the blood, for leaving you behind when I swore I never would. His signature, his old name, sat at the bottom like a scar he'd carved himself, the ink smeared where the pen must have faltered, maybe from a shaking hand or from tears he'd never admit to shedding. He felt sick reading it, the room tightening around him, the taste of ash and regret thick in his mouth. Clara. He hadn't spoken that name in years, not since the night he'd found the homestead burned to the ground and the bodies inside too charred to recognize. He'd buried the remains and the past together, certain she was among them, certain it was his fault. Yet here was a letter, his letter, kept and carried by a woman who'd known his real name and his crimes. His hand trembled as he set it down beside the locket, the words echoing through his mind like a voice from the grave. He looked toward the hearth where she slept, her face half lit by the fire's last glow. The lines of exhaustion softened into something almost peaceful, and the thought came unbidden, unwanted. She looks like her. Not just in feature but in presence, the same quiet strength, the same way she seemed to fill a room without speaking. His chest clenched. The years between now and then collapsed like rotten timber under his weight. He whispered to the dark, as if testing a truth he wasn't ready to face. Clara? But she didn't stir. Only the wind answered, a long, low moan that might have been mercy or warning. He turned back to the letter, tracing the ink with his thumb, knowing it wasn't enough to explain the years he'd run, the men he'd killed, the silence he'd built around himself like armor. Whatever story she carried, whatever vengeance or forgiveness had driven her through the storm, it was written in this paper, and tomorrow, when she woke, he'd have to ask what she wanted of the man who had written it. Because the one sitting in that cabin now wasn't sure he existed anymore. Morning came slow, dragging light through the gray fog that clung to the mountains like the last breath of the storm, and when she stirred by the hearth, blinking against the dim firelight, he already knew the night's uneasy peace was gone for good. The letter still sat between them on the table, smoothed flat by the weight of his guilt, and the locket beside it caught what little light the dawn offered, turning its silver surface into something almost holy, or damning it depended on how one looked. She rose carefully, every motion stiff with the ache of cold and exhaustion, and when their eyes met, she didn't flinch the way most did when faced with the man he'd become. Instead, she looked at him as though she were seeing through the years, past the beard and the solitude, to the man who'd written those words she'd carried across the storm. You opened it, she said quietly, not accusation, not forgiveness, just fact. He nodded, his throat too dry for apology. I had to know. She took a seat across from him, the fire's low hum the only sound between them for a time, until finally she reached for the letter, tracing the familiar handwriting with her fingertips. My sister kept it, she said, her voice trembling just enough to reveal what it cost her to speak. She kept it in a box beneath her bed, wrapped in a shawl you gave her, even after everything burned. She never stopped reading it, even when she stopped believing it. He swallowed hard, the ache behind his eyes pulsing like an old wound reopened. Clara, he whispered. She nodded once. She thought you betrayed her. Thought you sold the ranch. Left her to die in that fire. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shame through him, until he couldn't tell whether the heat in his chest came from the fire or from the past clawing its way back up his throat. It wasn't me, he said, but it sounded weak, too late. I came back too late. The woman's gaze didn't soften. Too late is still too late, she murmured. She died believing you'd turned her love into ashes for gold. He shook his head, hands curling into fists on the table. I lost everything that night. The land, the money, even my name. But not her. Never her. His voice cracked on the last word, and the confession hung there, raw and small against the enormity of years lost. The woman, her sister's kin, her mirror looked at him not with cruelty, but with the weary patience of someone who had spent a long time trying to decide what justice really meant. You think that makes it right? She asked softly. That guilt is the same as penance? He looked down at the letter, at the trembling of his own fingers reflected in the ink lines he'd written long ago. No, he said after a moment. But it's all I've got left to offer. For a long time she didn't speak. The wind outside had gentled, carrying the scent of thawing pine and damp earth, and the faint call of a raven echoed from somewhere beyond the ridge. She finally reached into her coat and drew out the locket, opening it with a slow, deliberate hand. Inside was a faded scrap of a photograph Clara, smiling, her face younger than memory, framed by wildflowers and sunlight. The sight of it hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He felt every year of solitude collapse into a single heartbeat. She kept you close, even when she hated you, the woman said, closing the locket. I came to know why. He leaned back, eyes burning. And now that you do, he asked. She looked toward the fire, her profile sharp against its glow. Now I see you're not the monster the stories made, she said quietly. But you're not the man she loved either. Maybe you never will be. Her words cut clean, but not cruel. They were truth, and he felt their weight settle deep inside, grounding him in a way nothing else had since he'd left the world behind. For a while neither moved, the silence between them thick with all that could never be undone. Finally, she reached for the letter again, folded it carefully, and tucked it back into the pouch. I'm not here to forgive you, she said, rising. I'm here to finish what she couldn't. He wanted to ask what that meant, but the look in her eyes stopped him, a look both familiar and foreign, the same flame that had once burned in Clara's when she'd stood against the world beside him. The storm outside was gone, but he knew another had just begun, one that no mountain could keep out, because the past had come home not for vengeance, but for truth, and the truth, he suspected, would be far more dangerous. He had thought time would dull it, that 7 winters of snow and silence could bury the memory of that night the same way it had buried everything else, but as the woman's words settled into the cabin's quiet, the past came roaring back, cruel and clear. Like a door kicked open on a room he'd tried to wall shut forever. He remembered the glow of fire against the sky, the smell of smoke that wasn't just wood but hair, fabric, flesh, the sound of men shouting in the distance, their voices drunk on blame and fear. It had started with whispers, always whispers, the kind that slid through saloon corners and around church pews, painting him as the kind of man who'd take a woman's love and turn it into ruin. They said he'd killed her for money, for land, for pride, depending on who told it. And when the ranch went up in flames, when the sheriff found her horse wandering half-burned near the creek, the lie became gospel. He hadn't even been there when the fire started. He'd been 2 towns over, trying to sell the last of their cattle, chasing a deal that might have saved them both, but guilt doesn't wait for truth to arrive. When he rode back and saw what was left, the whole world tilted. He'd searched until his hands were raw, and his lungs blistered from the smoke, digging through the embers until he found bones too small, too fragile, to belong to anyone but her. After that, he didn't fight the talk. Didn't try to explain that it was her brother who'd lit the fire in anger, or that the sheriff had helped hide it to protect the family's name. What was the use? The town had already chosen its story. Every face that once smiled at him turned away, every door that once opened shut fast. The preacher said men like him couldn't escape God's judgment, and he believed him. So he left, rode until his horse collapsed, walked until the land turned to stone and snow, until the last human voice faded behind him like the tail end of a curse. The mountains didn't forgive, but at least they didn't lie. He'd built his cabin from silence, hammered his guilt into every board, made his exile a kind of penance that no one had asked for, but he'd earned all the same. Yet now, with her sitting in that same space, her sister's eyes watching him from a different face, her sister's story laid out on his table in ink and ash, he realized that his silence had never been punishment. It had been cowardice, plain and sharp as a knife. He'd let a lie become her truth because it was easier than facing the men who'd made it, easier than looking into the eyes of those who'd lost faith in him and saying, I didn't do it, easier than staying in a world that had already buried him alive. The weight of it crushed his chest until he could hardly draw breath, his hand gripping the edge of the table like it might keep him from falling straight through the floor. He could hear her moving behind him, soft steps across the boards, the rustle of her coat, the faint creak of the pouch against her hip. He wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the truth he'd carried like poison for too long, but the words stuck, thick and useless. What good would confession do now? The dead couldn't hear him. Or maybe they could, and that was worse. He looked to the window, where snow still drifted lazy and cold, and saw his reflection in the glass. A man half ghost, half memory, trapped somewhere between who he'd been and what he'd become. The mountains outside seemed to lean closer, listening, as if waiting to see whether he'd finally speak. "I didn't kill her," he whispered, and the words felt foreign, like speaking in another man's voice. The woman didn't answer. Maybe she hadn't heard him. Maybe she had. Either way, the confession hung in the air, fragile and trembling, as the fire cracked and the light of morning turned the room pale gold. For the first time in years, he realized that silence hadn't saved him, it had only kept him buried. And now, with the truth clawing its way back to life, he wasn't sure which was worse, that the world might never believe him, or that she might. The first sound was soft, almost lost in the sigh of the dying fire, a dull, rhythmic crunch beneath the blanket of snow, too steady to be the wind, too heavy to belong to deer or elk, and before his mind could make sense of it, the horses snorted, shifting uneasily in the corral behind the cabin. The woman froze where she stood, her hand instinctively gripping the leather pouch, and he felt the old instincts surge through him like a match struck in the dark. The silence sharpened, the air thickened, and in a heartbeat he knew someone was coming. He rose slow, every movement deliberate, his chair scraping against the floor like the drag of a shovel through gravel. "How many?" he asked, voice low, eyes fixed on the window's thin pane of frosted glass. She moved beside him, peering through the cracks in the shutters, her breath fogging the wood. "4," she whispered. "Maybe 5. They've been tracking since the pass. I thought I lost them." The way she said it told him everything. These weren't lawmen chasing justice, but hunters chasing coin. The bounty. He'd forgotten about it, or forced himself to. 7 years hadn't been enough to bury that poster, the one with his face printed in bold black ink, his old name stamped beneath it. Wanted for arson, murder, and desertion. They must have smelled her trail and realized where it led. "Get away from the window," he murmured, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door, its metal cold enough to bite his palm. Outside, the sound of hooves grew clearer, slow, measured, confident, not the charge of desperate men, but the advance of those certain of their prize. He moved to the hearth, killing the light with a quick scatter of ash, and the cabin fell into the half-dark of stormlight and breath. The woman's heartbeat seemed loud enough to fill the room. "You brought them here," he said, not as blame but as fact. She flinched all the same. "They'd have come anyway," she answered, her tone hardening, defiance threading through the fear. "Men like that always find what they think they own." Through the shutter's slit, he saw them then, 4 riders, their coats crusted white, their faces hidden under wide brims, steam rising from their horses as they reined in at the edge of the clearing. One of them dismounted, kicked snow from his boots, and stepped forward with the slow arrogance of someone who had done this many times before. A bounty man. Maybe from the old territories, maybe one of the sheriff's dogs still hungry for the scent of his blood. The rancher, no. The man he'd been before the mountains felt something stirred deep in his chest, something equal parts fury and resignation. "You going to tell me what they want with you?" he asked quietly. The woman didn't answer at first. Her eyes flicked to the table, to the letter, then back to the door. "They don't want me," she said finally. "They want what's in that pouch, and the man who wrote the letter inside it." His grip tightened on the rifle. "So they think killing me gets them both?" "No," she said softly. "They think killing us does." A loud knock cracked through the storm, hard and commanding. "Cabin," a voice barked. "We know you're in there. Man fits the description, $50 alive, 20 dead, come out slow." He felt the years peel away in that instant, the calm of exile replaced by the raw pulse of the hunted. He'd built this cabin to forget the world, and now the world had found him again, dragging her into it. He glanced at her, and she met his eyes without flinching. "You can run," he said. "Through the back, follow the creek down." "I'm done running," she whispered. The wind outside howled as if mocking the choice. Another knock, louder. "Last chance." The man by the door laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the storm. "Guess we'll just come take what's ours." The latch shuddered under the first blow. He stepped forward, planting his boots firm. the rifle rising with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. "Stay low," he said, voice steady now. The woman crouched by the hearth, clutching the pouch like a heartbeat. Another slam, another crack. The door gave an inch. The firelight caught the barrel of his rifle as he leveled it. For 7 years, he'd lived like a ghost. Now, as the footsteps drew nearer, he realized the dead don't stay buried when the past comes calling. They stand and fight for the living. He slid the loose plank aside with hands that didn't tremble as much as he thought they would, the sound muffled by the howl of wind and the hammer of snow against the cabin, and guided her down into the shallow space he'd once used for seed and tools, tucking her knees in beside the coil of rope and the tin of nails, the wood above her like a coffin lid, only this time it would be a shelter. She shoved the leather pouch into the hollow of her shirt and pressed her face against the rough grain, eyes wide and shining in the lamplight. And when he leaned down, close enough for her to hear his breath, he said the only thing that felt honest. "Stay quiet, breathe slow. If they come through the door, I'll make noise to draw 'em out, then get you when it's safe." She nodded once, a small, fierce motion, and he felt something in him lock no fear now, only an old, cold resolve that had been buried under years of wind and regret. He dragged the plank back into place and pounded it tight, the sound loud in the cramped cabin, then crawled to the corner and drew the rifle down from its peg with hands that remembered every weight and balance like a prayer, the wood smooth under his palm as if it recognized him. The barrel was clean enough for the first fight in 7 years, and as he checked the shells, each metallic click sounded like the turning pages of a story he had promised never to read again. Outside, the men were in no hurry now. The leader barked orders that smelled of long-practiced cruelty, and the snowstorm that had sheltered them minutes ago now blew dagger, cold between the trees, spattering his porch with white like a mail of winter. The first axe blow split the door with a sound that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, and the second came before the timber could settle. He stepped into the doorway as they shoved through, a silhouette framed in dim light, the rifle steady against his shoulder, and he saw them at once, 4 faces she'd described, and then some, hard, empty eyes behind scarves, fingers twitching on holsters because killing was as much a trade to them as breaking horses. The first man charged with a blade raised. He fired, not aiming to kill the first time but to set the world alight. The slug tore into the snow beside the man's feet, and the recoil shook him back against the jam. And then men swore and dropped rifles and drew guns, and the air became a wolf's snarl. He fired again, heart pounding, each shot a sentence of apology he could never speak aloud, and the cabin became a blur of breath and movement, boots skidding on broken boards, a lamp shattering and sending oil like black rain across the floor. One of the men falling against the porch rail as the cold took at his blood, and he made a sound no laughter could ever have matched. Powder smoked in the little room, stinging his eyes, the salt of it mixing with the blood that began to darken the snowflakes drifting in through the open doorway. He moved with the odd grace of a man returned to a craft he'd sworn away, ducking, bracing, firing until the last of them realized the price of the prize wasn't theirs and began to pull back, dragging the wounded between horses and the hole where their greed had been. The leader tried to come at him close, knife glittering, and the rancher met him with a swing of the butt that cracked bone beneath leather, the man dropping like a sack of frozen grain, while outside another rider's shout cut off as someone else took him from the saddle with a clean, final bullet. When the gun smoke cleared enough for him to see again, the yard was a map of prints and crimson. Snow steamed where blood met cold, and the taste of iron filled his mouth. He sank to the porch steps, one hand pressed to his side where a grazed wound bloomed warmth through wool, and listened to the snow settle on the bodies like a shroud. Inside, the woman tapped the plank once soft, then twice. He answered with a low curse that had relief braided into it, and then slid the board aside to pull her up with both arms, feeling the slight weight of her in his hands as proof that what he'd done had not been in vain. She clung to him for a breath that tasted of smoke and fear, and then, when she looked up, there was no more hollow in her eyes, only the fierce, raw belonging of a soul that had been claimed by another's stubborn courage. The wind moaned on, carrying word of what had happened faster than any rider could, and he knew already the morning would bring sheriffs and questions and bounty seekers who'd heard of blood and come to gawk. But for that single moment on the porch, blood on the boards, snow at his boots, the rifle warm in his lap, he let the old name die easier, because a new one had grown from the violence. the man who kept his word, the man who'd finally stood and fought for what he would no longer lose. When the last echo of gunfire died, and only the storm's whisper filled the valley again, he sat beside her in the flickering half-light, blood drying on his shirt and smoke curling from the barrel that rested across his knees, the silence pressing between them thicker than the scent of powder or the cold creeping through the broken door. For the first time in years, there was no one left to chase him, no lie left to hide behind, only her eyes, wide and wet, demanding a truth she already half knew. He looked down at his hands, the lines of dirt and age dark against the raw cuts, and felt the weight of everything he'd buried pressing up through his ribs like a plow through thawing soil. "You want the truth?" he said, voice rough and hoarse from shouting and smoke. "You deserve it, I reckon, more than I ever did." She didn't answer, only reached for the blanket that had fallen to the floor, wrapped it around his shoulders, and waited. The waiting broke him faster than any bullet. He drew a long breath, eyes fixed on the fire, and began to speak, not like confession, not like begging, but like someone finally too tired to keep carrying ghosts. He told her about the night of the fire, how he'd ridden out trying to sell what little stock they had left, desperate to save the ranch that had been slipping away ever since the drought took the cattle and her sister's father drank what was left. He told her how, in his absence, greed and hate had walked through the door wearing familiar faces: Clara's brother, his own partner in the cattle deal, and the sheriff, a man who'd always hated him for being an outsider with more grit than gold. They'd come looking for the deed to the land, for the claim Clara's family still held. She'd refused, stood her ground, and by dawn the house was cinders. "They said I did it," he murmured, the words tasting of ash. "That I'd burned her for the deed, for the money they couldn't prove existed. When I came back, there was nothing left but bones and smoke. The sheriff made sure the town saw what he wanted 'em to see, and I—" His throat closed around the next words. "I didn't fight him. I couldn't. I thought maybe it was what I deserved for leaving her that night." He stared at the fire, the crackling logs like the memory of that burning house, and she watched him in silence, tears glinting along her cheeks, her hand trembling as it reached for his. "She never stopped waiting for you," she whispered. "Even when everyone said you'd done it. She kept your letter. She used to read it out loud on the porch at sunset, said one day, you'd come explain yourself." He shut his eyes, pain twisting through him like a blade turned slow. "And when I didn't, she died thinking I was a coward," he said. Maybe she wasn't wrong. She shook her head fiercely, the motion scattering tears across her face. "No, you were broken, not cruel. There's a difference." Her voice cracked, the truth of it cutting through the cabin's stale air like a fresh wind. He wanted to thank her, but the words wouldn't come. So he settled for laying his rough, calloused hand over hers, the firelight trembling against their joined skin. "I should have come back," he said. "I should have made the bastards pay, told the truth before they buried it." She squeezed his hand, her face wet but steady. "You just did," she said. Outside, the wind eased to a sigh, the snow softening its fury. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, not because the guilt was gone, it never would be, but because someone else now carried a piece of it with him, and that made it bearable. "Your sister was the best thing I ever knew," he whispered. "And you—" He stopped, the words trembling in his chest. She smiled faintly, eyes shining. "I know," she said. "I see her in you. Every piece of her that was lost, you brought back here tonight." He looked out toward the mountains, where dawn was beginning to stain the horizon with silver and pink, and thought that maybe, for the first time since the fire, the world didn't look like punishment anymore. The truth had come out bloody, but it had come out all the same, and in her tears, he found something he hadn't believed in for a decade. The quiet, dangerous hope that redemption might still have room in a life like his. The dawn came slow, painted in long streaks of rose and gold that spilled over the white peaks and crept down into the valley like forgiveness finding its way into a heart that had forgotten the shape of it. The fire in the hearth had burned to soft coals, its glow flickering across the cabin walls, turning the scars of the night before into quiet reminders instead of wounds. He stood there in the doorway, half in shadow, watching her kneel by the fire pit outside where the earth had thawed just enough to give way beneath her hands, her figure outlined against the pale horizon. She'd taken the letter from its pouch, the one he'd written years ago in another life, and pressed it to her chest for a moment before lowering it into the shallow hollow she dug. He could see her lips moving, not in prayer but in farewell, each word carried off by the morning wind that smelled of pine and wet ash. When the dirt fell over it, soft and final, something in him shifted, as if the act of burying those pages had freed more than the memory it carried. She looked up at him then, her face calm but streaked with the last traces of tears. And for the first time since she'd appeared at his fence line, she smiled, not the guarded smile of a woman braced for hurt, but the weary, genuine curve of someone who'd found peace in the ruins. "It's done," she said, brushing the soil from her palms. "The dead have had their say." He swallowed hard, feeling the morning air sting his lungs. "And what about the living?" he asked quietly. She rose and came to stand before him, close enough that the warmth of her breath chased away the cold lingering on his skin. "It's time you came home," she said simply. The words hit harder than any bullet, because they were both an invitation and a reckoning. Home wasn't a place anymore, it was the thing he'd run from, the people he'd let believe he was a monster, the truth he'd buried under 7 years of snow and silence. But as he looked past her, out toward the mountains glinting gold under the new sun, he realized that maybe coming home didn't mean going back. Maybe it meant stepping forward, into whatever life waited after forgiveness. He nodded once, slow, and turned toward the cabin's threshold, where the floorboards creaked like old bones and the smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered, a reminder of how close death had come and how stubborn life still was. The rifle leaned against the wall, its metal catching the dawn light. He left it there. For years it had been his only voice, his only way of keeping the world at bay. But now it looked small, almost pitiful, against the promise that waited beyond the door. He pulled on his coat, the fabric stiff with years of solitude, and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath his boots, wet and red in patches where the night had spilled its violence, now half covered by the drift of new flakes. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine resin, the sky stretching wide and clean above him. Behind him, she lingered in the doorway, watching as he took his first steps beyond the porch, her expression unreadable except for the faint glimmer of relief in her eyes. He paused by the fire pit, looking down at the fresh mound of soil, and said a name, her sister's name, so softly it barely made it past his lips. Then he tipped his hat, a gesture somewhere between respect and apology, and turned toward the trail leading down the mountain. Each step was heavy with memory but lighter with purpose. The crunch of snow beneath his boots, the sound of a man returning to the world. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ridge, and by the time he reached the bend where the valley opened wide and the land stretched out before him, the cabin was no longer in sight. Only the wind followed him now, gentle and warm, whispering through the pines like the echo of a woman's voice carried on the breath of morning. He didn't look back. Some ghosts didn't need to be buried twice. Instead, he kept walking, each step a promise, silent but certain that the man who had fled into the mountains was gone, and the one who descended them would finally live again.